rancher. Hadn't talked to women in years, until 3 Apache women collapsed at his door. Jesse was a rancher who had lived alone for many years. He wasn't always this way, but after losing his wife in a tragic accident, he found solace in the quiet solitude of the land. He hadn't spoken to a woman in over a decade. The memory of his wife Sarah haunted him every day, and the grief was a weight he couldn't lift. But it was impossible. Sarah had been everything to him, his heart, his soul. Pow. All he had was the land, the cattle, and the never-ending cycle of hard work. Jesse's ranch sat deep in the wilderness, far from any towns or other people. It was a place where only the toughest could survive. He had learned to live off the land, making do with what he could find, and relying on his own strength. His ranch was his world, and he had no interest in letting anyone into it.
Over the years, he'd built a small cabin, a barn for his horses, and a corral for his cattle.
He spent his days fixing fences, mending tools, and checking on his animals. He rarely left his property and had no need for social interaction. Desperate. The silence was comforting. It kept the pain at bay. But life, it seemed, had other plans for Jesse. One late afternoon, as he worked on mending a broken water trough near the edge of his land, Jesse noticed something strange. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance, barely noticeable. But as the sun began to set, the shadow became clearer. A figure, then another, and another. 3 women stumbling toward him. Their figures were small in the distance, but Jesse could see that they were in trouble. Their clothes were torn and they moved unsteadily, as though they could barely keep their balance. Breath. Jesse dropped the wrench he had been holding and wiped his hands on his worn jeans, unsure of what to do. He had spent so many years avoiding people, and now these strangers were coming to him. It was almost as if fate had brought them to his doorstep. But who were they? What did they want? He hesitated for a moment, his heart racing in his chest. He had grown used to being alone, and the idea of having to speak to these women, much less help them, filled him with dread. But as they drew nearer, the need for action became clear. One of the women collapsed to the ground. Her body, thin and pale, lay limp on the dry earth. The other 2 women staggered to her side, but they, too, looked weak and exhausted. Without thinking, Jesse rushed over to them. He was no longer the man who avoided human contact. In that moment, his instincts kicked in, and he knew he had to help. He carefully lifted the woman who had fallen, cradling her in his arms, but her body frail and thin. He carried her to his cabin, where the other 2 women followed closely behind. Inside the cabin, Jesse laid the woman on a cot and hurried to gather some water. He had a feeling they were in more danger than they let on, and he needed to act quickly. The other women didn't speak much, but their eyes told the story. Fear, exhaustion, and desperation were written all over their faces. One woman, the tallest of the 3, spoke softly in a language Jesse didn't understand. The words were foreign to him, but he could tell they were in pain. He handed them water and they drank eagerly, as if it had been days since they had last had a drop. The woman on the cot began to stir. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was covered in sweat. She was burning with fever. Parade. Jesse had seen fever before, from his own livestock, but never in a person. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a doctor, and he had no medical supplies to speak of. He did what he could, using the only thing he had, his own hands. Ah! Jesse wiped the sweat from the woman's brow and tried to cool her with a cloth soaked in water. As he worked, the other 2 women watched him closely. One, a young woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, sat near the fire, her arms folded across her chest. The other, older and more weathered, stood by the door, keeping a watchful eye on the outside. Breaths, Jesse felt their gazes on him, but he didn't look up. His focus was entirely on the woman in front of him, but he wasn't sure why he was doing this. He had no reason to help these women, no obligation, but something in him knew he couldn't just turn them away. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but they had come to him for a reason. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman on the cot began to stir again. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at Jesse with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, and her lips cracked with dehydration. Jesse offered her more water, and she drank slowly, her hands trembling. The other two women moved closer now, speaking softly in their native tongue. Jesse couldn't understand them, but he sensed the tension in the air. They were unsure of him, wary of his intentions. They had every right to be. He had not invited them into his home, and yet here they were, relying on him for their lives. Perhaps. Jesse had no idea who they were, but he could see that they had been through something terrible.
He couldn't turn his back on them, not now.
Jesse's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. They were Apache. That much was clear. But why had they come to him? What had happened to their people? He felt the weight of the questions pressing on him, but he knew it wasn't the time to ask. They needed help, and he was the only one who could give it to them. As the evening wore on, Jesse tried his best to make them comfortable. He gave them food, blankets, and anything he could find to ease their suffering. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but his actions spoke volumes. He wasn't the same man who had avoided human contact for years. He was someone different now, someone who understood the importance of kindness and compassion, even in the face of uncertainty. The women rested that night in his cabin, and Jesse sat by the fire, his mind restless. He didn't know what the future held, or what these women's presence meant, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. These women had come to him for help, and for some reason, he couldn't walk away. He had a duty to them now, whether he liked it or not. The silence of the ranch had been broken, and Jesse wasn't sure if it would ever return. Jesse woke the next morning to the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the cabin was quiet, save for the occasional shift of the three Apache women. He had spent most of the night tending to them, making sure they had enough water and keeping watch for any signs of danger. The strange weight he felt from their presence hadn't gone away, but in the light of day, it seemed to lessen just a bit. The woman he had carried inside, the one who had collapsed first, was still asleep on the cot. Her breathing had slowed, and her fever seemed to have broken. Right. She wasn't completely out of danger, but Jesse could see that the worst had passed. The other two women, the younger one with dark eyes and the older one with weathered skin, were sitting at the small table, speaking in a language Jesse couldn't understand. He didn't need to understand their words to sense their unease. The younger woman was fidgeting with a piece of cloth, her fingers picking at it nervously, while the older woman kept glancing toward the door, her eyes scanning the outside as if expecting someone, or something, to arrive. Breath. Jesse knew the feeling. He'd spent most of his life looking over his shoulder, expecting trouble from every direction. It came with the territory when you lived alone in a place like this. But these women weren't just anyone! Brace. They were Apache, and Jesse couldn't help but wonder what had brought them to his ranch. What kind of danger had they run from? He had so many questions, but none of them felt right to ask. Not yet. The quiet rancher moved to the stove and started preparing some food. It wasn't much, just some dried meat and beans, a simple breakfast that he had cooked for himself countless times. But as he worked, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He wasn't just cooking for himself. He was preparing food for others. And something about that made the silence of the cabin feel less oppressive. He placed the food on the table and the two women looked up. Their gazes met his for a moment, but neither spoke. The younger one, her eyes still wary, looked at the food and then back at Jessie. He knew she was unsure, but hunger had a way of making people set aside their doubts. Slowly she picked up the bowl, and the older woman followed suit. Jessie stood back watching as they ate in silence. But he wasn't sure if they were just being polite or if they were too tired to speak, but the quiet was comforting in a way. They weren't rushing, but they weren't hesitating either. The food seemed to give them some strength, and Jessie found himself wondering what had brought them to his cabin in the first place. After breakfast, Jessie stepped outside to check on his livestock, needing some time to clear his head. The air was crisp, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth. He could hear the sound of his horses in the distance, grazing in the open field, and the occasional rustle of a bird flying by. The ranch was quiet, just like it always was, but something about the presence of the Apache women had changed it. It wasn't just the noise that had changed. It was the feeling, the weight of the silence that had once been his only companion. Jessie stood outside for a long while, leaning against the weathered fence, staring out over the land he had worked so hard to make his own. But as much as he had built here, something felt different now. It wasn't just the Apache women in his cabin. It was the knowledge that he couldn't go back to the way things had been. His life had been a long stretch of loneliness, but now the silence seemed like a thing of the past. When he returned to the cabin, he found the women sitting around the fire. The woman on the cot was awake now, her eyes open, though her body still seemed too weak to move. The younger woman was tending to her, adjusting her blankets and offering her more water. Rasp. Jessie noticed the way they moved together, as if they had known each other their whole lives. The older woman stood up and approached him, her face unreadable. Breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough from disuse. Her English wasn't perfect, but Jessie understood her clearly enough. Brett. He nodded, unsure of what to say.
"I didn't do much. The older woman gave him a hard look, as if she could see through him."
Desperation.
"You did more than anyone else would have." She paused, glancing at the others. "You saved us." Jessie felt his chest tighten, but he said nothing.
He wasn't used to receiving thanks, especially not for something that felt like instinct to him. He had acted without thinking, and now, in the light of day, he wondered if he had done the right thing. These women had come from somewhere. Dangerous, that much was clear. But he had no idea what their real story was. As the day passed, Jessie kept himself busy with chores around the ranch. The women stayed inside, and he couldn't help but notice how they had begun to settle in. The younger woman, who had been so quiet before, now helped with small tasks. She wasn't speaking much, but she moved with a confidence Jessie hadn't seen from anyone in years. The older woman who had the most experience helped her, while the woman who had been sick rested on the cot, recovering. Jessie knew they weren't just staying out of gratitude. They were trying to survive. They had no choice but to depend on him for now. But he also sensed something else, a bond forming between them, a kind of unspoken understanding. But he knew that the Apache people were fiercely independent, and asking for help wasn't something they did lightly. They didn't trust easily, but they were here now, with him, and that meant something. As evening fell, Jessie sat by the fire, trying to find the right words. But they didn't come. He had always been a man of few words, and now that there were other people in his cabin, he didn't know what to say. The women were speaking to each other again, their voices low and soft, but Jessie couldn't understand their language. He had no way of knowing what they were saying, but he could see the expressions on their faces. There was something in their eyes, something that told him they were grateful, but also something deeper. something that told him they were hiding something. The quiet rancher couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to these women's story than they were letting on. They had come here for a reason. But what was it? First, Jesse didn't ask. He wasn't the kind of man to pry into other people's business. But as the days went by, he couldn't ignore the questions that gnawed at the back of his mind. Burrow, what had they been running from? And why had they come to him? The fire crackled, and the cabin grew darker as night took over the land outside. Jesse sat still, his eyes on the flames. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. Jesse woke up to the soft light of the morning creeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. The fire from the night before had died down, leaving the cabin in a stillness that felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the kind of silence he was used to, the kind that came with the empty land around him, but a new kind, one that was filled with the presence of others. 3 Apache women, who had come to him for help, were now part of his life, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Birth. As the days passed, things between them remained quiet, but not uncomfortable.
The women had begun to adjust to life on the ranch.
The younger woman, with dark eyes and a sharp gaze, had taken to the work quickly. Jesse could see that she was strong, not just physically, but in spirit too. Bass. She moved with purpose, whether she was gathering firewood, cleaning, or helping with the animals. The older woman, who had once seemed so reserved, now took on a guiding role. She showed the younger woman how to do things Jesse didn't even think about, like fixing a saddle or setting up a fire pit the right way. The woman who had been sick, the one Jesse had carried into the cabin, was recovering more slowly, but every day she seemed a little stronger. But there was a new light in her eyes now, a light that hadn't been there when she first arrived.
Shattered, weak, and vulnerable.
She still didn't speak much, but Jesse could see that she appreciated the peace he'd given her. It wasn't just the women who had changed in the past week. First, Jesse too had started to feel something different, something he couldn't explain. At first, he had been the silent rancher, doing what needed to be done without talking. But now he found himself looking up whenever one of the women passed by, wondering if he should say something. Maybe it was the way the younger woman would glance at him, her eyes holding a question he couldn't answer. Or maybe it was the quiet conversations he overheard between the women in their own language. Whatever it was making him feel like he wasn't as alone as he once thought. And for a man who had spent so many years buried in his grief, that wasn't something he was sure he was ready for. The mornings had become routine, the sun rising and casting its first light over the land. Jesse would start by checking the cattle, making sure the fences were in good shape and the horses were well fed. The women helped when they could. They weren't used to ranch life, but they adapted quickly. Jesse had learned that they were skilled with horses and could handle themselves in ways he hadn't expected. The older woman had a steady hand with the animals, calming the more difficult ones and showing the younger woman how to work the horses in a way Jesse couldn't. He had a grudging respect for them, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story. The land around them was vast, stretching out in all directions, and Jesse often found himself staring at the horizon as if expecting something to come over it. Someone, perhaps, who would explain what had brought these women to his doorstep. Russ. He had noticed the occasional glance they shared when something unusual happened, like when the younger woman found a trail of fresh footprints outside, or when the older woman checked the horizon with a nervous look in her eyes. Jesse had asked them nothing about where they came from or what had happened to them. He respected their silence. But that didn't mean his curiosity wasn't eating away at him. One afternoon, Jesse found himself walking toward the far edge of the ranch, where the land began to rise into a small hill. It was one of his favorite spots. From there, he could see the entire ranch and the surrounding wilderness. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the world in golden light. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see the younger woman walking toward him, her expression unreadable. Psst. She stopped a few feet away, glancing at him with those sharp, dark eyes.
"You don't ask much," she said, her voice soft but direct.
Rest. Jesse nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going.
I don't have a lot to say.
The woman tilted her head slightly. You've taken us in. You give us food and shelter.
But you don't ask who we are or where we came from. Jesse hesitated.
There it was. The question he had been avoiding. He didn't answer immediately, letting the silence hang in the air between them. The truth was, he didn't need to know. He had helped them because they needed help. That was enough for him. But the longer they stayed, the more he felt the need to understand what had brought them to his doorstep. I don't need to know everything, he said finally. I help when I can. And I can help now. The younger woman looked at him for a moment, her gaze softening. We are running from something, she said, her voice quieter now. But it is not something we can speak of easily. You may not need to know, but we owe you the truth. Jesse didn't press her. He didn't know what kind of truth she meant, but he could see that it weighed heavily on her. Instead of asking more, he simply nodded, respecting her words. Days passed in a similar routine. The women worked alongside him, and Jesse did his best to keep them comfortable. He never asked more than necessary, and the women never gave more than they had to. Still, a bond began to form between them, one that was unspoken but undeniable. Jesse found himself slowly adjusting to the presence of others in his life. He even started to look forward to the quiet moments when they would share a meal together. It wasn't much, but it was something he hadn't had in years. The night came, and the fire crackled in the hearth as Jesse sat with the women. They had eaten dinner in silence, as they often did, but the weight of the day seemed to press on everyone now. The younger woman, who had become more comfortable in her silence, looked up at Jesse again. You're not like other men, she said quietly. Breaths. Jesse frowned, not sure what she meant. How's that? She didn't answer immediately, but instead stared into the fire. Most men would have asked questions. They would have wanted something in return. Jesse felt a stir of guilt in his chest. Was that all they thought men like him were? He didn't see himself as anything special. Just a man doing what he thought was right.
I'm not asking anything from you, he said, his voice steady.
The younger woman smiled slightly, her lips curling at the corners. I know. Breaths nosh. That's why you are different. Jesse didn't respond. He wasn't sure what else to say. The silence between them settled again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't lonely. It was a shared silence, one that came from understanding, even if unspoken. Later that night, as Jesse lay in his bed, he thought about the woman's words. He wasn't sure what that meant, but he knew that these women had come into his life for a reason. And though he didn't fully understand why, he knew that he couldn't turn his back on them. Tomorrow, he would continue working, just like always. But now, for the first time in years, the work felt a little different. It wasn't just the same old routine. It was something more. And that something, Jesse realized, was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. One that didn't have to be written. in silence. The days continued to pass quietly, each one blending into the next like the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. Jesse had never been one for unnecessary words, and now, as he worked alongside the 3 Apache women, he found that silence had a new meaning. The ranch, once a place of solitude and grief, had become something else. A home, though different from the one he had known with Sarah. The women had, in their own way, begun to fill the silence. They weren't loud or demanding. They didn't try to fill every moment with chatter. But there was something about their presence, something that made the air feel alive again, even when they weren't speaking. Jesse had learned that they were survivors. They had traveled far to escape something dark and dangerous, but they had never spoken of it in detail. At first he had been curious, but over time he realized that asking too many questions would only make them feel like prisoners of their past. Instead, he focused on making sure they were safe and giving them the space they needed. The routine of ranch life had become their routine. Jesse, though still reserved, found himself easing into the company of these women, recognizing that they weren't just people in need of help. They were strong, capable, and in some ways he had come to depend on them as much as they depended on him. It was the older woman, Naya, who seemed to sense when things were changing. She was the most reserved, but there was wisdom in her silence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear, Naya spoke up, her voice low but steady. "You've done more for us than most would," she said, looking directly at Jesse.
"But there's something you don't understand."
Jesse, who had been sharpening a knife by the fire, paused. "What's that?" "There are dangers out there that you can't see," Naya continued, her eyes flickering to the younger woman. Aliyah, who had been standing by the door, her expression tense. "The men who came for us before, they won't stop." "They will come again!" Jesse's heart skipped a beat. The words were a heavy weight in the air, and for the first time he realized that his simple act of kindness had put them all at risk. He had always known there were threats in the wilderness, bandits, wild animals, the unforgiving land, but he had never imagined that something so far beyond his control would find its way to his doorstep. "You should leave," Jesse said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Go somewhere safe." "But... oh, hey, you don't need to stay here with me." Alia's sharp eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "We have nowhere else to go," she said quietly. "We've already been running for too long." Jesse didn't know what to say. Breath. He didn't want them to leave. Not now. The thought of them disappearing into the wilderness, vulnerable again, made his chest tighten. But he also knew that keeping them here might put them all in more danger. Naya spoke again, her voice softer this time. "We are Apache, Jesse. We don't run from danger. We face it." There was strength in her words, a quiet power that Jesse couldn't deny. She wasn't asking for his permission to stay. She was telling him that they would. Jesse didn't argue. He knew better than to try and convince them otherwise. The Apache had their own way, their own codes, and there was no changing that. The next few days were filled with tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension Jesse had expected. The women went about their daily chores with determination, as if the threat of danger had already been accepted. They didn't speak much about what had happened to them, or the men who had chased them, but their vigilance had grown sharper. The younger woman, Aliyah, would often slip outside after dark, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Naya, too, seemed to be on edge, her watchful eyes always on alert. Jesse, too, found himself looking over his shoulder more often, wondering if he was truly prepared for whatever was coming. The ranch was isolated, but that wasn't a guarantee of safety. He had grown comfortable with his way of life, content with his routine, but now he could see that he wasn't as prepared as he thought. These women, these strangers, had brought a sense of danger into his life, but they had also brought something else, a sense of purpose. One evening, as Jesse sat by the fire, his mind racing with worries about the future, he was interrupted by a sound from outside. It was faint at first, just the whisper of hooves on dirt. But as the sound grew louder, Jesse's heart began to pound in his chest. He stood quickly, his hand going instinctively to the rifle resting by the door. Breath. The three women were already standing, their eyes wide with concern. Alaya, with her sharp eyes, was the first to speak. "Someone's coming." Jesse nodded, his grip tightening around the rifle. He didn't know who it was, but his gut told him it wasn't just any traveler. He moved to the window, peering through the thin curtain. There in the distance he saw them, two riders moving fast, their horses kicking up dust as they galloped toward the ranch. "They found us," Naya said quietly, her voice steady but full of an underlying tension. "Stay inside. Don't let them see you!" Jesse felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't question her. He moved quickly, securing the door and checking the windows. The women had already gone to their places, quietly preparing for whatever was coming. Jesse couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness for them, even though he knew he wasn't ready for a fight like this. He had always been alone, but now he had people to protect. The riders came closer, their horses thundering over the dirt. Jesse held his breath, listening. He could hear their voices now, low and gruff, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Dance. They were close, too close. Without warning, there was a loud knock at the door. Jesse's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't hide forever, not from these men. He had to make a decision. Slowly, he approached the door, his hand on the handle. Diverse stance. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was about to happen. He opened the door, his rifle ready. The men standing on the other side were exactly what Jesse had expected, rough, hardened, and clearly not here for friendly conversation. They were armed, with rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes scanning the cabin with the sharpness of predators. The leader, a tall man with a weathered face and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed when he saw Jesse holding the rifle. "Well, well," the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we found our little hideaway." Jesse didn't answer. "He didn't need to. Where are the Apache women?" the man demanded, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. "We know they're here. You better hand them over." Jesse's mind raced. He knew he couldn't give them up, not after everything they had been through, but he also knew these men wouldn't leave without a fight. Pow! Without a word, Jesse raised the rifle, aiming it at the man's chest. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't going to let them take the women. Not after everything they had done for him. "I'm not giving them to you," Jesse said, his voice steady but his heart hammering in his chest. "You're going to have to go through me first." The night was thick with tension. The two men stood at the door, their eyes cold and unyielding as they stared at Jesse. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, louder than the soft rustle of the wind outside. His hand tightened around the rifle. He had never been one for confrontation, preferring the solitude of his ranch and the quiet routine of his life. But something had changed. The moment the Apache women had arrived at his doorstep, Jesse knew he had something more to protect. And now, standing face to face with these men, he was willing to defend them, even if it meant putting everything at risk. "You don't want to do this," the man with the scar said, his voice rough but calm. There was a hint of a threat in his tone, but Jesse didn't flinch. "Then leave," Jesse replied, his voice steady, the rifle aimed at the man's chest. For a moment the man's gaze flickered between Jesse and the women, who were hidden behind the shadows of the cabin. They had moved quickly, instinctively knowing what was coming, and had quietly positioned themselves out of sight. The younger woman, Alea was closest to the window, peering through the small crack, her eyes sharp and watchful. Aya, the older woman, had taken a place by the back door, ready to make her move if needed. The two men exchanged a look, clearly weighing their options. The scarred man sneered, his hand twitching toward the handle of his rifle. But Jesse didn't move. His grip on the weapon was firm, his stance unwavering. He wasn't going to back down, not when he had already promised to protect the women. The tension stretched out, thick and suffocating. Jesse could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he knew that if things went wrong, it wouldn't just be the women in danger. It would be him, too. But there was something else, something deeper, that pushed him forward. These women had come to him when they had nowhere else to go. They had trusted him, and now he was going to do whatever it took to keep that trust. The scarred man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're messing with, rancher," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can stand against us?" "I don't have to fight you," Jesse said, his voice calm, but there was a quiet resolve in it that made the man pause. "You'll leave now, or I'll make you." The man sneered again, but Jesse saw something in his eyes. For a moment, Jesse wondered if the man was considering backing down, but then the sound of horses shifting outside broke the silence, the unmistakable sound of more riders approaching. Jesse's heart skipped. There was no time left for talking. The other men were coming, and they were coming fast. He had to make a decision. The ranch wasn't big enough to fight off an entire group. He needed to act now, or everything would be lost. Without another word, Jesse swung the door wide and stepped outside, raising his rifle higher. The men hesitated, clearly surprised by the move. They weren't expecting him to be so bold. But Jesse had learned long ago that hesitation could be deadly. "You don't want to do this," the scarred man said again, but his voice was less confident now. "Get off my land!" Jesse replied, his eyes cold. Suddenly, the sound of hooves grew louder. More riders were closing in, their figures appearing through the dust and twilight. Jesse's heart raced. He wasn't sure how many there were. But it didn't matter. The danger was real, and it was here. The man with the scar looked over his shoulder, his eyes widening as the other riders appeared on the horizon. "Damn it!" the scarred man muttered, turning to his companion. "We need to go." Jesse didn't wait for them to make up their minds. With one swift movement, he aimed his rifle at the sky and fired. The loud crack of the gunshot echoed across the ranch, and the men flinched, looking back at him. It was a warning shot, not meant to kill, but to make them understand that he wasn't backing down. For a moment, there was stillness. The riders on the horizon were close now, just a few hundred yards away. The scarred man's hand hovered over his gun, but he knew what would happen if he drew it. Pay. Jesse was ready. The younger woman, Alaya, had already slipped out of the cabin, her eyes sharp as she scanned the area. Stood in the back, her posture tense, waiting for the signal to act. And then, as if on cue, the men made their decision. The scarred man cursed under his breath and nodded to his companion. Without a word, they turned and spurred their horses, riding off into the darkness, leaving the ranch behind. Breath. Jesse stood in the doorway, his rifle still raised, watching them disappear into the night. The sound of hooves faded, and the ranch grew quiet again. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but there was a sense of relief now, a feeling of victory. For a moment, Jesse thought the danger had passed. But the rioters would be back. He knew that. These men wouldn't give up so easily. And the threat to the Apache women wasn't over. Jesse had a feeling this was only the beginning. He lowered the rifle slowly, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The women had come to him for protection, and he had kept them safe. For now. But how long would that last? The questions swirled in his mind, but he didn't have time to dwell on them. The ranch was still standing, and the women were safe, but Jesse knew it wouldn't be long before the storm came again. Inside, the women were waiting, their eyes on him, waiting for him to speak. Jesse stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind him. He took a moment to catch his breath before turning to face them. The younger woman, Alia, was the first to speak. "You did it!" she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "You kept us safe!" Jesse didn't answer right away. He was still processing everything that had happened.
He had acted on instinct, but now that the danger had passed, he felt the weight of the moment. He had done more than just protect them.
He had stepped into a role he hadn't expected. A protector, a leader, someone who could be counted on. But he wasn't sure he was ready for all of that.
He wasn't sure he knew how to be the man they need him to be.
But Naya stepped forward, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "You are ready, Jesse," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "You may not see it yet, but you are. We trust you." Jesse didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so many years alone, hiding from his past, avoiding any connection with others. But now, standing in the glow of the firelight, with the women he had protected standing before him, Jesse realized that he wasn't alone anymore. He had a responsibility to them, and somehow, despite the fear and uncertainty, that responsibility felt right. "We'll face whatever comes next," Jesse said, his voice steady and sure. "Together." The words felt strange on his tongue, but they also felt like a promise. And for the first time in a long time, Jesse believed in the promise he had made.